Welcome everyone. My name is Suzanne Pichetti Johnson. I'm with Avenues to Wellness, and we are a program of the Frank R. Howard Foundation. I am very pleased and thankful to introduce our guest speaker today, Rosalie Anchordoguy. She is a certified nurse, midwife, and registered nurse. She practiced for 40 plus years, spending most of that time at the beginning of life with birthing, family planning, and women's health care. She recently retired after spending 4 years as a hospice nurse. She also spent time in public health doing HIV/AIDS work and is currently volunteering in COVID vaccination clinics. Today she will be speaking on the topic, the end of life journey and the hospice path. Thank you very much for being here today.
Thank you,
Rosalie.
Susanna. Thank you for inviting me and having me. So hello everybody. Yes, here I am, and I wanted to talk about hospice care, and I don't represent any specific program, just sort of my experience having been a hospice nurse. And really, hospice is a program that supports individuals at the end of their lives and helps them make choices about what they want to do and what they want to have happen for them, and helps them make a plan. So for me, hospice is about choice. How do you want to spend whatever time you have left on this planet? Many people start with treatment of whatever their condition is, and then maybe that's not working anymore, and then they have to decide, well, what do I do next? So really how we got to this point is that our medical system is so fabulous, and we are so fortunate in this country to have all this technology available like that. So that means they can keep us alive for a really long time, and that is wonderful news. Now, what happened around the 1960s is that medical care started focusing on CPR, cardiopulmonary resuscitation, and that's the chest compressions and the mouth-to-mouth breathing or ventilation with a bag. And really what this did was, in a hospital setting or in an out-of-hospital setting, when someone had a sudden emergency, a team could resuscitate them and keep them alive for longer. Okay, so wow, our lives are being prolonged with this fabulous technology. And also around that time, the emergency medical services became more and more competent and higher quality. So the ambulance people, the paramedics, the EMTs are so educated and so skilled at what they do. You call them, they get to your house, they can do what they need to do to keep people alive, they can put in an IV, they can transport them to the hospital. So it kind of changed how we have to decide about things. So that was sort of the 60s. Then Medicare came out in the 60s, and in the 80s, Medicare started with the Medicare hospice benefit. So what it is, in a nutshell, there's regular Medicare, and that pays for your doctor's visits, and your now you get Part D to pay for your pharmacy, and it pays for your x-rays and your tests. And then there's Medicare hospice. And when you go on to Medicare hospice, it's a benefit that you've paid for through your taxes, so it doesn't cost you anything. And Medicare hospice focuses on the end of life. When you go on that program, your regular Medicare stops. Medicare hospice doesn't pay for 911, transportation to the hospital, ambulance services. It doesn't pay for chemo, radiology, things like that. It pays to keep you comfortable at home. It pays for the medications, the equipment that you need to be comfortable at home, or if you're lucky enough to live close to a hospice facility, to cover you being in a facility. So that's a decision that people have to make. Usually when you go on hospice, you have made the decision not to be resuscitated. So that's another thing that came up, probably around 1990s, is the POLST, P-O-L-S-T, physician-ordered life-sustaining treatment. Okay, it's that fuchsia form that many people fill out. It's something that you do either at a certain, advancing age. Gosh, I'm getting to be 90. I'm in my 90s. I feel totally fine, but, people could, it's not impossible that I might at some point die. Or someone who has a serious medical condition, then they do have that awareness that maybe they are not going to live forever. So with the POLST, you decide, well, do you want to be resuscitated? And do you want to have a full resuscitation? Do you want a limited resuscitation, a trial of resuscitation? Like, well, give me a good 5 minutes, and if it looks like there's hope for me, keep going. But if not, send me off. Let me fly. Do you want to have full medical interventions such as IVs, medical treatments, or do you want limited? Yeah, try me out, and if I do well, great, continue. But if not, I don't want to be kept alive when my care is futile, meaning I'm not going to get better. And when you look at things like cardiopulmonary resuscitation, younger people, it's fabulous, but frequently when we're older and have had medical conditions that have debilitated us, the outcomes aren't as awesome as they are in a younger person. So you have to look at that. Do you want a feeding tube? That's on the POLST form. Yes, I definitely want a feeding tube. Do you want a trial of a feeding tube? Yeah, like if I have to have a gut operation and I'm not going to be able to eat for 2 months, but you expect that I'm going to recover, sure, put one in, keep me alive. But if I'm having to do it to sustain my life, is that really what I want? Because really, between respirators and feeding tubes, you can be kept alive for a very long time. And if that's your wish, it's perfect. It's all about choice. What do you want? What is your plan? Now, do you remember the name Terri Schiavo? She was a beautiful soul who I think had taken a diet drug and had a massive heart attack in the middle of the night. In the morning, her husband woke up and saw that she was incapacitated, got her to the hospital, and she was determined to be in a persistent vegetative state. And they inserted a feeding tube, and sometimes you need to do things like that to do a full assessment, to find out if, what is this person's potential for recovery. Okay, so she had this feeding tube. A feeding tube was placed. I don't think she ever regained any level of consciousness where she could ever make that decision. So after, was it 5 years, her husband said, she wouldn't want to live like this. This is not what she wanted. But her family felt, well, there's a flicker. Maybe those are reflexes. I think maybe she's there. So there was this conflict that involved certainly the medical ethics people in this hospital, certainly the courts, the husband, and her parents, trying to figure out what was the best option for this precious soul who was unable to communicate, move. I guess she could move a little. And I've seen pictures of her, and I thought, it does look like maybe she's there. Anyway, after 15 years, it was decided that by the courts that the feeding tube could be removed. And then after that happened, she lived 2 weeks because she was unable to swallow and do anything to sustain her life. And apparently she never returned to any level of consciousness. But, I think of her poor parents. They're losing their precious daughter this way and feeling that there was hope that maybe she was there, maybe she would come back. 15 years. And then my understanding is afterwards, they did autopsies on the brain, and they said there was absolutely no way that she had anything that we would call consciousness. 15 years. Wow. So that was a big, and I'm kind of saying these just sort of, to my mind, what are the highlights in how we get to hospice. And then certainly in 2018, 3 years ago, California came up with, maybe it was 2016. It was in the last 5 years or so, with the death with dignity and the right to die option. And that's an option that is legal in California. And if someone is terminally ill and they have two physicians that say they are terminally ill, and this person is of sound mind, is not demented, they can do all the paperwork, set it up to where they could take these meds that will end their life. And so those are kind of some of the big highlights in what's happening around dying. It's a medical, technical, legal, spiritual, event. That's why it's so important for people to know, for me, to know what I want and have it figured out and make sure my family and friends know, because believe me, poor Terry Schiavo, I hope that never happens to me. I wouldn't want to live in a hospital for 15 years on a feeding tube. So anyway, okay, so that sort of brings us to how the hospice programs have emerged, because medical care is so fabulous. When do you say no? When do you say, how do you want to spend however long you have on this planet? Do you want it to be in the infusion center, going to the hospital for your labs, in the radiology treatment clinic? Or do you want to be at home with your family and friends? I went to, when I was working for hospice, we were on call, and I went one night in the middle of the night down to Ukiah to help this family. This gentleman was in his 90s and he died, and it was just perfect. I thought, bingo, that's what I want. He was in his rocking chair. He had his cat on his lap. His kids, his grandkids, a couple of greats were around him. He was right there. It was in the winter. The fire was going, and he just passed peacefully in his chair with his cat.
Wow.
And I thought, write that down for me. That's what I want, And or do you feel more comfortable being in a hospital? Do you feel like, I feel much more secure when I hear the beeping of that machine? That's what I want. And it's about choice. And in this country, you can, up to a point, have what you want in terms of that, in terms of those interventions are paid for us, through Medicare. What I wanted to talk about now was sort of symptoms. What hospice does is focus on the symptoms and helping people be comfortable. So certainly pain can be a major symptom. And in this country, Western medicine is very closely tied with pharmacology. So many of the interventions that we receive with our healthcare can have to do with medications. So that's a choice for people. I see plenty of people who say, no, I never took drugs in my whole life. I don't want to do that. Great. It's up to you. You have a choice. But if your pain becomes really intense and you don't want to tolerate it, there's a whole buffet of meds that can be offered to you. And for the most part, the hospice physicians are experts at medical management, narcotic management of pain. There's a wide range of normal. Some people have hardly any pain, and they just untie their wings and they fly off and they're fine. And other people really struggle with severe pain. and that they may be very happy to use morphine or methadone or whatever the physician is prescribing for them. Certainly, nausea and vomiting, pretty unpleasant symptoms. There are meds for that. Some of the meds that they've developed for chemotherapy are fabulous, and they can help people be more comfortable. I mean, really, when you talk about quality of life, if you're sick every day, not very pleasant. So that's an option that a client may or may not take advantage of. And then sometimes, really frequently, people toward the end of their lives stop eating and drinking. It's often a slow decline. People are eating less, drinking less, hardly eating and drinking. And many times at the end of life, people lose the ability to swallow. Okay, so is that when, do you want to go to the hospital and get an IV and get hyperalimentation therapy, artificial nutrition? Do you want a feeding tube? Is that what you want? Or do you want to focus on a natural death, which has to do with the declining of these functions? And it's up to you. So it's really helpful, especially on the feeding one. It's hard for us in this culture because we're so fortunate to have so much food in this country, and most of us, our problem is that we eat too much, not eat too little. So how it's hard for us to see our loved ones stop eating because we know, well, there's only so long that you don't eat and drink before you take off. So it is very common, maybe the client is not wanting to eat anymore. Maybe it's a conscious decision. I see people who are like, I want out of here. I'm ready. Take me now, Lord. And it's not always that easy. So maybe they decide, I'm not going to eat or drink anymore, and then I will decline and fly. Or maybe they're not able to swallow. So it's very important for the family to be on the same page as the client, because if my father is feeling like he doesn't want to eat or drink anymore, and I'm like, okay, let me make you your favorite soup, and I think it's really good to offer people food. Hospice is not about taking food away from people. It's there. Do you want it? And if you don't want it, to honor that and let it be. But it is hard for the family and the people standing by. But again, this is a choice of, do you want interventions or do you want to just let a natural death continue? I have a couple of great stories, but one I can think of right now. This little lady, she was 101. I went to see her in the morning, and she lived in like a residential care facility. So we're always asking how much people ate. And I said, well, what did she have for breakfast? Oh, she had scrambled eggs, she had 2 pieces of French toast, and she had a cup of coffee. And I'm like, really? And they go, oh yeah, that's her favorite meal. She has it every morning. She was dead by dinner. She had this big breakfast, and then something happened, and by dinner, she had died. I was like, wow. So we do focus a lot on this long, slow transition, and some people just they take off. Life-changing events can happen at any time. So we don't know the whole food thing, and now I'm spiraling off. Suzanne better keep me on track.
Oh, you're doing great,
so
don't you worry.
Pain, certainly constipation can be a major issue as people spend more time in bed, as people become dehydrated and are eating less, and if people are taking narcotics. The narcotics affect the part of our brain to help us keep from feeling pain, but it also affects the intestine and causes more constipation. So again, there are stool softeners, there's herbs, there's products, there's Metamucil, all those kind of bowel aids that are available to people, if they need it and if they choose to take advantage of it. Confusion, dementia. Death is a physical, emotional, spiritual event. And confusion always throws something into the pot. And why are they becoming more confused? Is it dehydration? What's going on there? And is that part of the letting go? So frequently confusion comes up more at the end of life. And I always say, don't worry, you'll find your way. It gets really confusing, but you'll find your way. You'll get through all of this. Some people get very confused and are hallucinating. Again, that can be, okay, well, this is interesting, and ride that wave. Or they can become very shift into a completely different energy field, to where they're people who can't walk and haven't been out of bed decide to get up and go under the couch and ferret around and look for a shoe, and are falling, hurting themselves, getting cuts on their arms, on their faces from hitting their head, just really heartbreaking things. So if they're just confused and they're happy, great. But if they're a danger to themselves, a lot of times they need to be medicated to keep them safe and to keep them in bed. Again, at that point, the client is beyond that level of reasoning and decision making, but mainly it's the family that might make a decision that they would like to have that symptom medically managed with either light meds like a Valium type med, lorazepam, or something stronger if that didn't work, to keep them safe and to keep from, the family trying to be always with them and vigilant, and then somebody falls asleep and they find grandpa out somewhere else. Somebody who hasn't been out of bed in weeks is out in the other room and on the floor or whatever. So confusion, hallucinations. There's something called terminal restlessness that can occur in frequently the last days or hours of life, where people really downshift into a completely different energy field, and they can be all over the place. And if the family can just hang out and always have somebody with them to make sure that they are safe, that can work. But frequently, by the time that happens, the family's a little fried, and they may choose to use a pharmacological intervention to help calm the client and manage that behavior. Like I said, it's all about choice. And modern hospice, there's a lot of medication management that the client, the family can accept or not. So I think a lot of people do the gradual withdrawal, eating less, drinking less, spending more time in bed or on the couch, and then, those symptoms keep increasing, and then I think of it as they just start to spin their cocoon, and they go more inner. They become more inner focused, and then they get ready and they untie their wings and take off. And certainly religion and spirituality. Some people have very strong spiritual and religious beliefs, and that is perfect for hospice and perfect for any time in life. Certainly some people like to have some kind of a blessing and last rites type, sacrament of the sick type blessing. That's a Christian tradition, and there's many other, Buddhist traditions, Hindu traditions, different things that are very comforting to clients and the families. Certainly many families pray with their loved one, either throughout the dying process or the day of the dying or afterwards. Again, really hospice tries to respect all traditions. The goal of hospice is to help this individual come to the end of their lives as comfortably and peacefully and gently as possible. And it's not about imposing anyone's views on anyone else. So it's really a beautiful program, and I think that we're really lucky in our county. There are 2 hospices. One is Adventist Home Health Hospice, and the other is Ukiah Hospice. Adventist is a Medicare hospice, which has to go through the Medicare guidelines, and Ukiah Hospice is not. So if you're interested in those programs, I recommend you call them directly and get the information and get your questions answered. But we're lucky to have that level of support in our community and to have some expert physicians that are very knowledgeable about end-of-life care and medical management and death. So what can you do throughout your life? I think keep your relationships current. We never know. People can be in a car accident. Life can change in a flash. So for me, seeing all of this has made me feel like even more committed to being present in my relationships and with my husband, with my kids, with my siblings, with my family, that I don't want to have a disharmony with anybody. And if I do, I want to call you up and like work it out now, because what if I die tonight? I'm not planning to, but who knows? We never know. So I think it's about keeping our relationships current and being able to love and being able to accept love, okay? And also being able to forgive ourselves. Many people, I know this one, we're hard on ourselves, and it can take a lot. If I feel I've harmed someone, done something that wasn't something I maybe would do if I thought it over a little better, if I didn't react or something, I have to forgive myself about that. And then also, if someone has done something to me that I kind of interpreted as harmful, I have to forgive them. You know, we're all divine souls in human form, and most of us are doing the best we can. So give love, receive love, forgive myself, forgive others. And then I think get your affairs in order. Don't wait till you're, on the last gasp, but be thinking when you get a certain age, well, okay, I want to make sure this, any legal affairs that I have are tied up, and I got to do this paperwork, or I should do this. Maybe I should do it will. Maybe I should make sure my family knows what I want. If something happens to me where I'm suddenly unable to make decisions for myself, well, I've got my post already filled out so that my family knows and my medical care know that I want this to be done. So wills, the post, all of that are very important parts of us being ready. And I spent most of my life around birth, and the similarities between death and birth are so similar, and that's, I think, why I became so comfortable in hospice care. Do you remember in the 80s, we all started out with these birth plans, and you'd say, I want this, and I don't want the vitamin K, or I want this shot for my baby. I want erythromycin in the eyes, not silver nitrate. All these detailed birth plans. And that's kind of like what you need to do with your older age years. Get ready. Someday this will come up for you. If you've been born, you definitely will die. Full circle. I think I'm repeating myself, but
no, you're not.
Be ready. Get ready. Get clear what I want. Make sure I got my forms in order, that my husband, my son, my siblings know what I want. So in the event that I can't decide for myself, it's all right there. So I think that's kind of winds it up.
Very comprehensive, yeah, in a nutshell. So how did you make the transition from beginning of life and birthing to end of life? What
Well,
happened?
It's full circle.
Yes,
really
it
what
is.
happened, I had some issues where I needed an easier job. And people go, you picked hospice for an easier job, but it's a very emotional job, but it is physically easier because, like for me, I worked in an in-home hospice. So I drove to somebody's house, I got out, I walked into the house, I did my thing, maybe if I had time, I sat down on the couch and talked with the family and the client. Then I got up, I walked back to my car, I sat down in my car, I drove somewhere else. So physically it was an easier job for me. But I think having been a home birth midwife for decades, I'm very comfortable in that setting. I'm comfortable with improvisation because it's not like when you're in the hospital and you go, could I have the pediatrician please? Or, please, will you start this IV on this person? You have to
Think
have
on
a
your
little
feet.
flow.
Yeah.
And so it was actually a pretty easy transition for me. Birth and death are both transformational experiences. They are both transitional. Now, some people, there's the whole pregnancy, and then you have the baby, and some people have a long labor, and other people, bingo, this kid plops out. And there is the phase of labor, the end of this first stage, which is known as transition. And with the end of our lives, we get into, it can be a longer, slower transition, and then we take off. Or it can be fast. And then neither of them, what I like, I think, is that they're not tied to the clock. You're going to have your baby when you have your baby. And it doesn't matter what your due date is and how long you've been in labor. At some point, this child is going to come out, and won't it be wonderful? And with death, we know, I was born, there is one way out of here, and that's through the last threshold into the next realm. And so they're very similar, and they both involve waiting. You wait. It's not up to me who lives and dies. It's not up to me when a baby's born. I might have ideas that might facilitate the mother. And also during pregnancy, you like to work on the issues that might cause someone to stall in their labor. And same with dying. Well, what about your relationship with your son? I had one gentleman who was very, very isolated, tragic guy. And I said, do you have, what about your family? And, oh, no, I have a brother that lives nearby, but, I don't want to bother him. Well, do you have any children? Well, I have a son. Well, where does he live? Oh, he lives in another state. And I said, well, does he know that you're at the end of your life? No. And I said, well, do you want me to call him? Oh, I don't have his phone number. And I go, you don't have his phone number? Oh, boy. And so this went on for a couple of weeks, and then he started transitioning where he really withdrew and became pretty unresponsive. And I go one day, and his brother and his son are there. And I go, oh my gosh, how did you find out, and did you come all the way from this other state? And he said, no, I live here. And I go, well, what do you mean? And he lived 15 minutes away. And I said, did your dad know that you'd moved back to California? He said, yeah. And I said, wow, I would have called you weeks ago because he was clearly declining, but I didn't know how to reach you, and he said he didn't have your number. So anyway, there was this beautiful reconciliation at the bedside, but the client was unresponsive. Okay, then afterwards, I called the son to see how he was doing, and he said, you know what? He said, when I went through my father's clothes, in his pocket, he had the son's phone number and the brother's phone number. So like I said, it's about choice. So it's great that they did have this last 48 hours, but it was too bad the man was unresponsive. But they did, and the son came, and the son took care of him, and he would have come weeks earlier because he really only lived about 12 minutes away. Interesting, huh?
Very interesting.
Very interesting.
Yeah.
So now I'm off on another tangent.
No,
my
that's
nature,
fascinating.
But it's a transition, and it is a transformation, and for whatever reason, I don't know why the man wouldn't call his family. I would imagine something really painful had happened, and somebody was filled with shame or remorse, and I don't know, did he not feel worthy of their love? I don't know. But he's off into the next realm, and everybody was, his brother and son were with him when he died, and that's a success story.
Do you see that relationship between unresolved feelings and people hanging on more so?
Yeah.
And then maybe an opening up when there is some resolution?
It certainly can be, people are waiting for something to happen, and then it does, and then they fly. So the things that hold us here.
Yes.
So it's always good, throughout our whole lives, it's good to be clear.
You mentioned that.
And
you
to know
really
what
brought
we're
that
doing.
out.
And I think it decreases my own suffering if I stay clear with people.
Yes, yes.
It's very interesting.
That is.
And I really, it's a very rich experience, and I really enjoyed it. And it was really fun. So many of the people that are dying were 90 to 100, and like people who had been, I had one gentleman who was in Hawaii and was a military subcontractor. He wasn't in the Navy when Pearl Harbor happened. He and his friend it was a Sunday morning, they were going horseback riding, and they were driving, and they pulled off the side of the road on this lookout. They were there when the Japanese Air Force came in and bombed Pearl Harbor. They saw the whole thing. And I just love talking to these old people. You meet them and they're like a little rickety, but they have had these full lives. Can you imagine that? And one other gentleman, he was with, in that age group, the military. World War II is major lifetime event, and like one who had been with MacArthur in Korea when Korea fell and they were airlifting out, and just these interesting stories that you hear about what their whole lives were like. The richness of their lives.
Yes.
And the women, you meet them and they're just like little old ladies, and then like, you did that, and you were in France in World War II, and you were blah, blah, blah. You were at Los Alamos, and you were working on, not that I'm great on the bombing of Hiroshima, not at all, and the creation of the bomb, but people who were involved in these incredible historic events that you'd never know, but they're part of dying. People do a life review, and I just loved being honored to hear the stories.
Yeah, so rich.
Yeah,
you mentioned flying away several times. Did you experience or witness a lot of spiritual things?
Oh, definitely, certainly I have a spiritual bent on that, and then it really depends on the person's spiritual beliefs. But like I said, I see a lot of people, they spin that cocoon, and then I just sort of think of their little wings tied behind them, and maybe under the bed, and then they just untie their wings, and at the right moment, they take off. So that's how I see it.
You have sensed that.
I sense that, and I envision that for people.
I see.
Untie your wings and just go. You don't need to do this anymore. Your family will be okay. You're suffering. Why?
So you give them permission to fly.
Oh, definitely. And their family, too. I mean, I want the family to do that, and it really depends on their spiritual beliefs. I had one gentleman, I just totally loved him, a Hispanic man, and he was very devoted to Our Lady of Guadalupe, who I love. And I could just see, she had her arms open. She was calling him to her. And finally, he went, and they flew off. So,
yeah. And you mentioned quite a bit about relationships, keeping them current and all. How can families, and I understand how important that is through your whole life, to make that transition easier. Is there anything at the very end that families can do to facilitate the end of life?
well,
What do you see there?
Certainly, let me go back too about the whole hospice program. You know, usually there's nurses, social workers, a home health aide.
Yes.
So the social worker can do a lot of counseling with the family. That's a beautiful role for them. And so if you see that there's some issues, maybe the social worker will sit down with that family and help facilitate it.
I see.
So what did you ask me?
How can the families facilitate the end of life?
Yeah, well, then letting go and like, I've seen people, it's just tragic to witness, who are basically continuing to feed a family member long beyond.
I see.
And people will pocket the food in their mouth, and so will say, well, look at, he's not really swallowing that, Offer him food like you would a toddler. You put a little bit on a spoon, and if they eat it, you can say, do you want some more, sweetheart?
Right.
But if you're not going to give your baby continually putting food in their mouth when they can't swallow it, because look at that behavior. He is telling you that he can't swallow.
Right.
And if you continue to feed someone who has lost the ability to swallow, they'll choke. And they'll get it in their lungs, and they'll get a pneumonia.
I see.
But so it's sometimes family members can feel like, that's Susanna, she's being obstinate and she's just not going to eat and we need to feed her. Where it may be that, I shouldn't have said that, used you, but maybe maybe someone has lost the capacity to swallow, and it's not that they're being obstinate, it's that they are unable to swallow. So certainly the family being in tune with the clients.
With the process of letting go, and for them to be able to let go of their loved one.
Right.
In order to give them permission to let go.
And maybe sometimes the family, it's always a dance with narcotics. Because if you take narcotics, most of us, if you haven't taken them all your life, you're going to be a little sleepy and you're going to be altered. So maybe I want my mother to be clear. And so I don't want the nurses, I don't want her to have any morphine, but maybe she's struggling.
Right.
And she's uncomfortable. And so there has to be a solution where hopefully the family can do what the parent needs and wants. And that's why it's good to have figured it all out, try to figure it out ahead of time. Because if someone's not struggling, how perfect, you don't have to take any medications.
Right.
But if they're in a lot of pain, and sometimes people with cancer can have very intense pain.
Yes.
Then
it's the humane thing to do then.
Yeah.
Yes.
And for me, I don't think I have a great fear of death, but I really don't want to die alone and in pain.
Yeah.
So I don't have a personality where I want to be snowed on drugs all the time. But if my choice is intense pain versus sleeping, I'll go for the sleep.
Yeah, for sure, yeah.
So I want my family to know that. So
ahead of time, when you have the sense.
I would like to do this with being lightly medicated, but I want you to know if I am, having horrific pain, I want you to make sure that I'm medicated.
And that can save a lot of fighting within the family too.
Yeah,
I imagine.
The family, even like people who are continuing to feed their loved one, they're doing that because they desperately want their mother, father, grandmother to stay alive. You know, they're not
Yes.
doing it out of meanness or
Right.
negativity. So that person has to be helped to see, you know, what's going on. And, you know, it used to be people died at home all the time. But then we moved, when in, was it 30s, 40s, we moved more to a hospital
Right.
model.
Right.
And there's great things for that. You just have to kind of figure it out. And like I said, it's about choice. It's not about the nurse. It's about the choice. So I kind of see myself as laying a buffet, and you can select what you want. I'll take a little of this. I don't like that. I'll take some of this. And then you try it, and then you go, guess what? I hated that. I want to try this. So it's about choice and flexibility and helping people have as comfortable transition as they can into the next realm. And if they are believe in the afterlife, if they believe in that they're going to the Buddha and they're going to be reincarnated, if they believe they're going to Mother Mary or Jesus or Lakshmi, any form of Mother Divine, so be it. And so I think that's fun. I can get into any of those. I don't really care. I think you ought to believe in something and go for it. And if you tell me what you believe, I'll roll with that when you're dying. You know, so it's a rich thing. And that brings up like cremation or burial. Part of when you're figuring out your plan. Well, what do you want? Do you want to be cremated? Do you want to be buried? Where do you want to be buried? Where do you want your ashes placed? And that helps the family because sometimes they've never had these discussions. And I go, well, what are you going to do? And they go, well, I don't know. Well, what does she want? Well, now she's unresponsive and I don't, you know. So there is a time that seize the moment and do that work ahead of time, and it'll pay off later. And then you can just sit there and hold people's hands and love them and support their transition to the next world.
Beautiful. With a more peaceful transition, having done all that preparation.
Yeah.
Yes.
It's not chaotic, you know.
Yes.
And really, there's a childbirth activist who was very common in the 70s, Gail Peterson, and she said, women give birth the way they live their lives. And that is so true with death. It doesn't mean that calm, peaceful people don't have a hard time sometimes, but it's not really what happens to us, it's how we deal with it. So if someone has a calm, quiet nature, they may have some bad days, but that's how they're going to deal with it. Whereas if they're really dramatic and loud and da-da-da-da-da, that's how they're going to deal with it. So we carry our natures with us throughout our lives and into the last moments.
And you really experienced that both at birth and death.
Yeah.
With the personality of the person.
Right, definitely.
Fascinating.
If I'm afraid and I'm like really dramatic and oh my God, Susanna, get the I have another contraction. And I'm dying. I'm dying. That's right, you're dying. I mean, that's a little cavalier.
So yeah,
but,
right.
You know,
I know what you mean.
It does play out.
Yeah. Yeah. So interesting. Yeah. Well, I really thank you, Rosalie. This has been such a rich and interesting talk, and I think that kind of the circle of your career is so beautiful, having started with birthing and ending with end of life. And I really thank you for that service, because not everybody can do it.
Thank you, and thank you for inviting me, Susanna.
Well, it's been a really great experience, so we all appreciate it.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you. We'll see you next time.